there was a very early interest on the part of the United States in the Danish West Indies that goes back to 1867, as most of you know. And the then U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, who, by the way, came here to visit St. Thomas, and he verified that St. Thomas would be a very good coaling station for the American Navy. And this was primarily from the standpoint of trying to spread and use the Monroe Doctrine as a way of keeping other European powers out of the Caribbean and keeping the Caribbean as its sphere of influence. And you have to recognize that France had been involved with the Mexican Maximilian affair under Napoleon III, and the United States had been supporting Juarez, who ended up executing a firing squad for Emperor Maximilian. And so there was a definite attempt by the French that was stopped to have a direct influence in Mexican affairs. And it's at that time that the United States and Secretary of State Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine against France. So later, when Seward was trying to purchase the, it wasn't all the Danish West Indies, it was only St. Thomas, St. John, because all he was interested in was really having a coaling station for the U.S. Navy. And besides that, since the United States was in bad relations with France over this Mexican affair, and since France, by treaty, was supposed to give its approval for any Danish sale of St. Croix, they suspected that France would refuse, would turn down the sale of St. Croix to the U.S. And so therefore, for those two reasons, St. Croix was being omitted from that purchase, the first one, 67. Now, it was finally, after much stalling by the Senate, it was, I don't think that there ever was a vote in the Senate on that question. It was simply tabled. The issue was tabled. And of course that was a great insult to the Danes, who at all levels had approved the sale. It was ratified by their own Senate, etc., and the king, and everybody had approved it. But Seward was very unpopular with the Senate. They felt that the price of $7.5 million for St. Thomas, St. John was outrageously high for such a small island. And they felt that they'd just been gypped and fooled by Seward by convincing them that they should buy Alaska, which at the time was considered just a lot of ice and snow. So Seward was a bad name in the Senate. So anyway, there was a renewed, sort of a vague renewed attempt in the 1890s, but it didn't go very far. Somehow the Spanish-American War in 1898 kind of interrupted that. Then the third attempt was in 1902, and at that time was very close to the opening of the Panama Canal, and the Navy was then concerned about defending the access to the Panama Canal. So there was an attempt. There was successful negotiations with the negotiators involved, but the upper house of the Danish parliament had a tie vote on it, and so the matter was abandoned, was rejected. The whole treaty was rejected because of that. In other words, the equivalent of the Senate in the Danish Congress didn't approve it, and so it couldn't go forth. Now, what you should know is that there were competing German interests for the Danish West Indies. The Port of Hamburg is probably, well, certainly the largest port in the Baltic, no, the North Sea, I'm sorry, and very important. The city of Hamburg is somewhere around 2 million in population, so it's a very important city port. And it's had relations with the Danish West Indies going way back to the days of the Brandenburgers in the 17th century. In 1847, a number of German businessmen got together and created the Hamburg American Line as a packet line to service the Americas, including, of course, the Caribbean. In 1873 is when the Hamburg American Line established its headquarters, its Caribbean headquarters in St. Thomas Harbor, after getting a concession from the Danish government. This was after the Royal Mail Packet had moved its headquarters from St. Thomas to Bridgetown, Barbados. So I guess the Danish government looked at it as a way of surviving when losing a very important company like the Royal Mail Steam Packet, British company. In 1899, the Hamburg American Line named as their general director a man by the name of Albert Ballin, B-A-L-L-I-N. He is the one who really developed that company to its to the point where it was the largest steamship passenger or packet company in the world, and it had lines going all over the world, all continents, not just the Americas. It so happens that at that time the ruler of Germany was Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was known as an ambitious expansionist, and he was, it so happens, he also was the largest stockholder in the Hamburg American Line. So naturally, this was for very good reasons. He viewed the Hamburg American Line as a perfect means to expand German commercial and political influence in the Caribbean and throughout the world. And of course, since both he and Ballin had similar goals, in other words, expanding the line. They were both very close friends, to the point where Ballin had an apartment specifically reserved for the Kaiser in his own home in Hamburg. So when the Kaiser came to Hamburg, he stayed with Ballin. So you can well understand that there was obvious merging of functions between the the German Navy and the Hamburg American line, that the two were working very intimately together as a result of that collaboration of these two people. And so you can't blame the US Navy if they considered the Hamburg American line as nothing more than a front for the German Navy and a covert way of getting around the Monroe Doctrine. If nothing else, if it was very easy for the German Navy to subsidize the Hamburg American line, simply from the fact that its ships were getting their supplies and their coal from the Hamburg American line. So you could very easily make the transaction in favor of the line, so that the line would always appear to be prosperous and that it could grow. So let's go on about the actual purchase. Now, there were a number of changes that occurred in the situation of the islands in 1912, when the US Navy showed a renewed interest in the purchase of the Danish West Indies. And these changes had occurred since the end of the Spanish-American War that lasted only a few months. For example, the construction of the Panama Canal wasn't quite completed, but it was only 2 years away from that. But on the other hand, the US Navy had leased in perpetuity the eastern end of Cuba at Guantanamo Bay. So they already had that in 1912. They already had Guantanamo Bay as a large naval base. Additionally, there were other bases, as you know, in Puerto Rico and adjacent eastern islands, Vieques and Culebra. So at the same time, other changes occurred in St. Thomas. According to a naval intelligence report dated July 6, 1912, a Danish syndicate was about to be granted a major lease in St. Thomas Harbor to improve the port facilities and to conduct tax-free transshipping business after the opening of the Panama Canal. The syndicate was composed of 5 leading businessmen, Danish businessmen, but it was known that who was behind financing that company, none others than German bankers. Furthermore, it was said that the lease concession had a clause that would allow selling the lease or parts thereof to any friendly foreign government or shipping interest. 3 months after the Naval Intelligence report, the rumors were confirmed with the official establishment of the Danish West India Company. And back in 1902, a Dane by the name of Niels Grøn, who had adopted the US citizenship and who had been a negotiator for the US, had warned the US that the then planned Danish West India Company was a German scheme under quotation mark, to take over the Danish West Indies. In conclusion, the author of the report stated, "It seems only natural that German shipping interests should want a port in the West Indies. In view of their enormous interest, and there is no question but that in time they will be compelled to challenge a policy," and we're talking about the Monroe Doctrine, "which thwarts this, even as they now challenge the British interests, which seem to them to block the legitimate expansion of German interests." Sorry. Now, also, we have to know that in July of 1912, the U.S. Navy agitated again in favor of the acquisition of the Danish West Indies. And this had nothing much was initiated by the U.S. State Department until 1915, after several important developments. First, starting in 1910, and for the next 4 years, the Danish West West India Company invested $2 million worth of improvements in the harbor. $2 million then would be about 200, I'm sure, today. So this was an, oh, thank you so much. This was an enormous sum of money that had been invested by German bankers, remember. But supposedly for a Danish company. And of course, they were hoping that at the opening of the Panama Canal, this would increase the maritime traffic in need of coaling, fueling, transshipping, warehousing, provisioning, and repairs. According to a report dated September 1915 and prepared by the American Consul in St. Thomas, C.H. Payne, these improvements included extensive dredging of the harbor, building docks, warehouses, and placing buoys. Quotes, "A large part of the main harbor has a depth of 31 feet or more. This depth of water is found leading to and alongside principal coal docks, that is to say the Hamburg American Company dock, the St. Thomas dock, Engineering and Coaling Company, the Creaky's Coaling Wharf, the West India Company, and the East Asiatic Company. The West India Company's wharf, which is just being completed in a large modern structure, being 2,100 feet in length, with a bridge extension from the west end of 300 feet, making a total length of 2,400 feet, with a water depth of 31 feet along the whole length. There are 2 coal elevators having a capacity of 100 tons each per hour. These elevators are operated by electric power and cover a space of 1,100 by 200 feet, that being the space covered by these elevators in moving over the tracks. There's about 4 acres of land outside of this coal yard extending east and southeast. A warehouse of 440 by 50 feet and more than 20 feet high, and 2 oil tanks. This was the beginning of the use of oil as fuel. Oil tanks of 8,000 tons capacity, each have a completed recently, and others have to be built in the near future. A pumping plant of 2 force pumps for receiving and discharging oil through the pipelines that connect the tanks with the wharf front, where connections are made with ships. The wharf is provided with modern methods of securing vessels while alongside. A series of wells and a large filtering plant is in process of construction. This additional provision is intended to segment the water supply in order that there cannot in the future be any question of lack or cheapness of water for the shipping. So in other words, they had really made tremendous improvements in the facilities of Waco. To the list of improvements made, and this was observed by the American Council in St. Thomas. By the way, he was housed where Zora is housed today. You know Zora and Norgard? That was the American Council's place. To the list of improvement made by the Danish West India Company should be added those of the Hamburg American Line, which built on an 8-acre plot on Hassel Island 3 large warehouses, cisterns holding 1,500 tons of rainwater, and a motorized dolly on rails to facilitate the loading of coal, in addition to enlarged docking facilities with a frontage of 300 feet and a depth of 30 feet. Also, on St. Thomas proper, next to Emancipation Garden, the German company built for its offices a large concrete building, the first on St. Thomas, with a novel plumbing system fed by a cistern on the roof. I don't know if any of you have ever seen photographs of what we call today, I guess, the old district court building that used to have a cistern on the roof. Let's talk now about Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz and his U-boat strategy. As had been long anticipated, the Panama Canal was officially opened under U.S. protection on August the 3rd, 1914. Unfortunately, World War I was declared a week earlier on July 28th. As a consequence, commercial maritime traffic in the Atlantic was drastically reduced. The St. Thomas economy plummeted, and the investments made by the Danish West India Company and the Hamburg American Line, as well as by other harbor companies, were seemingly wasted. During World War I, the German Navy, unable to compete with the British and their large fleet of surface warships, decided to put their naval strength in submarines, the U-boats. At the start of the war, there were 29 U-boats, and 4 years later, by the end of the war, 360 U-boats had been commissioned. 168 U-boats were lost during the war, but the German U-boats sank about 5,000 Allied ships, or Allied or neutral, any ship that would bring supplies to the Allies was fair game for the German U-boats. Thus, U-boats proved to be extremely effective in interdicting maritime traffic in and out of the British Isles and the French coasts. Within 10 weeks of the start of the war, German U-boats sank 10 British cruisers. Shortly thereafter, in February 1915, Admiral Hugo von Pohl declared that the waters around Great Britain and Ireland, including the Channel, were in the war zone for supply vessels of any nation, including neutral nations such as the US. This declaration was followed in April 1915 by the sinking of the British relief ship, the Harpalice, on its way to the US East Coast. Then, on May 7th, sailing out of New York, the British luxury liner Lusitania was sunk off Ireland by a U-boat with 1,959 passengers on board. 1,198 passengers were lost, among whom were 128 US citizens. The German embassy informed that the Lusitania would carry war supplies to the Allies had warned the American public via the press that the ship might be attacked and was fair game for the U-boats. Nevertheless, the Lusitania sailed out of New York with a full complement of passengers who were not told that the ship carried war supplies in its cargo hold. Still, the American press and the public were shocked and outraged at this act of German provocation. So, of course, strong complaints were placed with Kaiser Wilhelm, but of course nothing was done about it. But what this incident did was to bring to mind to the U.S. Navy that German U-boats were a definite threat to shipping anywhere. And of course the American public, this was really a turning point for the American public against Germany. Before that, the opinion about which side to support was very divided, but certainly after the Lusitania, there was an overwhelming a favor of the American public against Germany. So from that time on, the 7th of May 1915, you can see the U.S. Navy agitating again for the purchase of the Virgin Islands, of the Danish West Indies. So in June, the State Department finally got going, June of 1915, only a month after the Lusitania. And the negotiations started again. Initially, the sale price was to be $30 million, and it was lowered to I think 25 million by August. But so in August of I'm sorry. The negotiations went on until August of 1916. But the deal was essentially done by the end of 1915. And after that, it was really negotiating over details. Yeah, it took a while for the Danes to accept the idea of selling the islands. Initially, they were reluctant for sentimental reasons, and also because they felt financially committed with the Danish West India Company, which was a tremendous investment that they didn't want to lose. So, and they had hope for a rebirth of the economy of St. Thomas through this means. However, they had to recognize that the Danish West Indies had a total indebtedness at the time of already $2 million. This is outside the WICO. That the islands had a combined deficit of about $200,000 annual per year. That the war was ruining the economies, the World War I, of both Denmark and the islands. Although they weren't directly involved, it did have a very depressing effect on just global economy, of trade. The war was ruining them, that they could no longer afford to support the islands, that they could well use the gold from the sale, proceeds of the sale of the islands, and that either the US or Germany might seize the islands by force if Denmark refused to sell. That's a very important consideration, and that given a choice between the US and Germany, Denmark would much rather sell to the US than to Germany. So in the end, then, the Danes went along with the idea of the purchase. Now on the American side, it was Admiral George who was the leading proponent for the purchase of the Danish West Indies. And in a memorandum dated December 1915, addressed to the Secretary of Navy, Josephus Daniels, and ultimately also to the Secretary of State Lansing, he enumerated solid reasons for the necessity of urgently purchasing the Danish West Indies. One, the acquisition of Danish islands would advance our flag 35 miles due east and that much closer to Anegada Passage. Two, the General Board, we're talking about General Board of the Navy, does not consider that there is any military reason for acquiring the Danish West Indies. No military reason. The harbors and waters of Puerto Rico and the adjacent islands now under our flag, adjacent islands meaning Culebra and Vieques, they offer under our flag as good facilities as the Danish islands, and they are so near that the acquisition of Danish islands for the mere purpose of establishing a U.S. naval base would not be worthwhile. Three, the Danish islands, however, do afford several harbors and anchorages more or less protected by prevailing winds and seas, and more or less capable of artificial defense that would be very useful to a foreign nation, meaning Germany, of course, conducting a campaign in the Caribbean if that nation, meaning Germany, were an enemy of the US. The resulting situation would be exceedingly embarrassing in the conduct of a campaign by the US. Denmark is a small nation with limited sea power, and it would not be able to prevent the seizure of the Danish islands by a strong military power such as Germany, desirous of using them as a base. It might not even be able to withstand an attempt by such a power to purchase the islands. 4, it is advisable that the Danish islands should come under our flag by peaceful measures before the war. The Caribbean is within the peculiar sphere of influence of the US, and if any of the islands now under foreign jurisdiction should change their nationality, the General Board, this is the Navy, believes that for military reasons the US should not tolerate any change other than that to the US itself. So now you understand that that is really the crux of the matter. 5, the General Board believes that the political aspect, meaning the Monroe Doctrine, reinforces the military argument, which has just been advanced. 6, for this political reason, therefore, if the acquisition of all the Danish West Indies can now be peacefully brought about, the General Board believes it is highly desirable that it should be done. 7, the harbor of St. Thomas on the island of that name and Coral Bay of St. John are the two best harbors of naval purposes in the Danish West Indies. Daphne, here comes St. John. Where was it? Oh, yeah. Are the two best harbors for naval purposes in the Danish West Indies. Great North Side, Magens Bay, on the north coast, St. Thomas has considerable anchorage ground, but it is open to the northwest. The board believes that unless an extensive breakwater is built, it would be an uncomfortable place for harborage. Moreover, there is only a small settlement on the bay, and hence there are no artificial facilities there. The island of St. Croix has no adequate harbor. 8. Comparing Coral Bay and St. Thomas Harbor, the latter has at its head the town of Charlotte-Amalie, already established with limited commercial and industrial facilities. Population of Charlotte-Amalie is about 13,000. Interesting. The harbor is susceptible of excellent defense by shore batteries. There is no settlement of any size on Coral Bay, and that site for a naval station would be practically virgin territory. The anchorage area available for large ships at Coral Bay appears, from an inspection of the chart, to be somewhat greater than that of St. Thomas Harbor. The bay also appears to be susceptible of good gun defense. Islands under British sovereignty lie so near that the approach to the bay must be through British territorial waters from northwest around by the northeast. Of the two, the General Board considers St. Thomas Harbor is the more advantageous for use as a naval base. In this connection, recent consular reports show that considerable improvements to the harbor have been undertaken during the last 3 or 4 years by the Danish government, and that the depth of 30 feet of water may now be found over a greater portion of it. An officer now on duty of the Naval Intelligence, and I suspect it was none other than James Oliver, who was later governor, informs the General Board that he learned when he was in St. Thomas about 2 years ago that the Hamburg American Steamship Company had a concession and was making great improvements in the harbor for the accommodation of its vessels, probably with a view of the opening of the Panama Canal. Now listen to this. The nationality of this company creates a presumption that the German government is in sympathy with, if not actually behind, the establishment of a considerable station of maritime supply and outfit. This is significant when taken in connection with the proximity of Denmark and Germany and the relative size and power of the two nations. It has been widely reported, although the General Board is not in a position to substantiate the report, that the sale of the Danish West Indies to the US under negotiations a few years ago was stopped by German influence in the Danish Parliament. In conclusion, the General Board is of the opinion that the acquisition of any harbor in the Danish West Indies would not materially benefit the military position of the US in the Caribbean, but the acquisition of the entire group would be of some military and great political advantage for reasons stated in this letter, meaning for reasons of interdicting the islands to the Germans. The next 6 months of negotiations were strictly about details, the sale price of 25 million, and how everything had to be approved 90 days after. And so finally, August the 4th, the negotiators signed the treaty at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. Then it was transmitted by Wilson, President Wilson, to the Senate, that very quickly ratified it, September the 7th. Then it went to Denmark, and there, for fear of German political pressures on the Congress of Denmark, the Riksdag, they decided to put it to a referendum, and 64% of the Danish voters voted in favor of it. So after that, the Riksdag had no alternative but to follow suit with their approval. So finally, on January the 16th, President Wilson was the last one to affix his signature. Now, we briefly want to show that how the Germans tried to save the Hamburg American line through some ploy at the last minute. It's significant that, according to the Sale Treaty, all private properties, including the Danish West India Company, had to be respected. In other words, the United States didn't buy the rights to those properties, that the owners had to be within their possession rights, including the Danish West India Company. So in other words, the US Navy could not use the WICO facilities for its own uses. It had to remain as a private company, a Danish private company. But what about the Hamburg American line and its port facilities? Well, barely a month after President Wilson's signing, on the 11th of February, Zabrinsky, the vice consul for the United States in St. Thomas, dispatched a cable to the State Department that stated, February 5th, 11 a.m., confidential informer announced officially today, Hamburg American Line has sold entire properties here, excepting the 2 detained ships to lawyer Jurgensen for $175,000 American dollars. So the bill of sale by the Hamburg American Line is dated January 22nd, but the sale was not recorded until February the 3rd, about 10 days later. Now, immediately after the news that the US had broken diplomatic relations with Germany. So at that point, of course, the Germans realized that America was about to declare war, and as the new owners of the Danish West Indies, it was going to quickly seize its properties and consider them as enemy properties. So in the hopes of forestalling such a US initiative, the Hamburg American Line were sold, it was a bogus sale, to a Danish lawyer, the Crown Counsel Jens Peter Jurgensen, who renamed the assets of the Hamburg American Line the Harbor Accommodating Establishment. And the whole sale was, I mean, everything was sold for $175,000, which is about a tenth of what the properties were worth, the assets were worth. So it's obvious that this was a bogus sale. And of course, the Americans were smart enough to understand that immediately. Attorney Jurgensen, it so happens, was a well-known German sympathizer whose daughter was married to a German, and the sale of the company's St. Thomas asset for $175,000 is so ridiculously low that, I mean, it smells. The whole thing is ridiculous. So subsequently, it would seem that there was a rush on the part of the St. Thomas director and staff of the Hamburg American Line to flee to Curacao a neutral Dutch island during World War I, where the Caribbean headquarters of the Hamburg American Line were relocated. Also, there was a concomitant rush on the part of the U.S. to take possession of the Danish West Indies, Danish West Indies, and to declare war against Germany. About 2 months after the signing of the Treaty of the transfer. Oh no, I'm sorry. About 2 months after the signing of the treaty, on March 31st, in Washington, the Secretary of Treasury, William McAdoo, in the presence of the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, in charge of the islands, and Rear Admiral James H. Oliver, this in Washington, newly appointed governor of the islands, presented a treasury warrant of $25 million in gold coins, representing 48 tons worth of gold. So of course, all they could hand in, you needed several trucks for that. So it was, anyway. So they signed a warrant, and simultaneously, this was cabled to St. Thomas, and at the same time, then the transfer ceremony started here after they were told that the Danes had been paid in full. That's interesting. It couldn't start before they were actually paid. That shows what the Danes, what their interest was. Anyway, they wouldn't take a check in the mail, in other words. Of course, as we know, Oliver was then in Washington. He didn't have time to get down here. So the nearest ship here had as his commander, that was USS Hancock, had as his commander Edwin Pollock, who then acted as the governor instead of Oliver for the ceremonies here, the transfer. Only a week later, on the 6th of April, the U.S. declared war on Germany. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. Alien Property Department confiscated $100 million worth of Hamburg American Line assets, properties, throughout the U.S., including 17 liners, and all the St. Thomas properties camouflaged under the Bogus Harbor Accommodating Establishment, and 2 liners. The company had 2 liners in St. Thomas. At the same time, as priority upon his arrival on St. Thomas, Governor Oliver ordered a Marine battalion under the command of Major Saladay to immediately secure St. Thomas Harbor from a possible German naval attack. By August 1917, so it wasn't even 6 months later, just a few months later, Major Saladay was already reporting the completion of the construction of 2 batteries of 4 5-inch guns each, one at Red Point and one at West Gregory Channel, and a second at Mulholland-Fells Point that defended the entrances to West Gregory Channel, East Gregory Channel, and the St. Thomas Harbor. 15 months later, at the end of the war, in late November 1918, demonstrating that it was not a priority, the Alien Property Department turned over to Governor Oliver the properties of the Hamburg American Line on St. Thomas and Hassel Island, which the Navy used as a small naval base, but that was after the war. On the German side, this is interesting, 2 days before the armistice, on November 9th, 1918, distraught over the losses inflicted by the Allies to the Hamburg American Line, General Director Ballin committed suicide with sleeping pills at his Hamburg residence. And finally, a few days later, his good friend Kaiser Wilhelm II, unable to face the consequences of his ill-conceived, aggressive policies, abdicated his throne and went into exile in the Netherlands, where he lived until his death in 1941. So, I find it interesting. Of course, I suspect the worst of the Hamburg American line, although I haven't been able to get any figures, any actual numbers of anything. But I mean, there's so much evidence, I mean, surrounding this whole thing, circumstantial evidence, that I'm sure that the threat was real. And I think we have to thank both Dewey and Oliver for sparing the Caribbean with, preventing the U-boats attack, German U-boat attacks in the Caribbean. It's interesting that the contribution made by Admiral George in convincing politicians that we should quickly purchase the Danish West Indies, that to thank him, they offered him, see, Rear Admiral, Admiral Dewey's leadership role was recognized by Secretary of Navy Josephus Daniels by proposing that the Danish West Indies be renamed in his honor the Dewey Islands. Fortunately, on March the 2nd, 1917, at a large mass meeting in Charlotte, Amalia, there were loud protests against such a proposal, and Dr. Viggo Christensen, representing the public sentiment, proposed instead that the islands be named the American Virgin Islands. As a consolation prize, Pueblo Culebra was renamed Dewey. Now, Rear Admiral James Oliver, when he was chosen governor of the American Virgin Islands, was at the head of naval intelligence. And it must be logically assumed that this appointment was a reward for informing Admiral Dewey of the alarming covert plans of the Germans. That's my take on it.
Dr. Caron, I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned in 1867, when they were first talking
Yes,
about
yes.
purchasing the islands.
Yes.
St. Croix was not included.
Yes.
Okay, so what happened between 67 and 1914, where I guess St. Croix became part of the deal? I mean, how did St. Croix get into the deal?
Well, if you heard some of the arguments from the U.S. Navy, they felt that the U.S. should get all the islands because they wanted to make sure that the Germans wouldn't use any of them for their purposes. They were afraid that they might relocate themselves on St. Croix if St. Croix weren't included. The other thing, of course, is from a diplomatic standpoint, France and the United States were on good terms, so that, of course, France would have approved the sale of Denmark to the U.S.
St. Croix to the U.S.
Yeah, St. Croix. Yeah, you know, in the transfer ceremonies, there was a French representative.
So in other words, when the Danes purchased, so St. Thomas Transfer Day is commemorating when the Danes purchased St. Thomas and St. John from the Danes and St. Croix from the French. Is that what happened?
No. No. When
Really?
one of the clauses when St. Croix was sold by the French to the Danes, one of the clauses that they could not dispose of St. Croix without the approval of the French government. Okay? So, knowing that France and the United States were in bad diplomatic relations in 1867, and besides that, knowing that it didn't have a good harbor and it wouldn't be useful as a coaling station, there was no reason to include St. Croix in the deal in 1867. But later, in 1916, the situation was totally different. That's the whole point. It didn't need a coaling station. What it wanted is to keep the Germans out. That's the only concern they really had. So they wanted all the islands to make sure that they wouldn't be able to use any of them.
Dr. Caron?
Yes.
I do a historic tour of Hassel Island every weekend. It says on the placard, probably put up by Charles Gonzalo, but it says 1910 is when Hamburg American Line left here, or what year did they finally, I mean, were they here all the way till 1917 as far as the coaling station?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And there was reports that the U.S. Navy had blown up the fuel tanks at, you don't know about that? Just throwing it at you.
I mean, if they did such, it must have happened in World War II or something.
Right. Well, 1867 was the hurricane and the tsunami, so when they were trying to buy them, it was probably like a washout because you said.
Yeah, well, that added another
Right.
argument for the Senate to turn down Seward's Folly, they call it.
And I've been reading from 1916 just about the sale the last year, and it's either October. They had a major hurricane here.
Yes.
Wiped out the whole island.
Yes,
Yeah.
devastating.
Seriously. So I don't think the Danes had enough money to rebuild the infrastructure, or, you know, so they might want, because they were hedging in the Senate. They could read.
Well, you know, their elevators for coal loading was totally demolished.
Right. They said the two cranes in
The
1916
two cranes
got
were
destroyed.
demolished. And as a result, the coal carriers were able to go on strike and win double their salary.
That's Queen Kuzaya.
No. This was years
Oh,
after
after.
Queen Kuzaya. We're talking about 1916, not 1896.
Yeah.
No, it was Moorhead. Thank you. The union leader.
Out of St. Croix.
Was he out of St. Croix?
Originally, yes.
But anyway, he represented the harbor workers, and so they were able to double their salary because of it. And I think the strike lasted 2 hours. They had them over a barrel. I mean, there was no way they could operate without the coal carriers.
The bunker over on Water Island, that was built because there was another threat from the Germans in World War II?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's strictly World War II, yeah.
It's Fort Cigar.
Yeah, and of course the U-boats did come in World War II, and were very devastating, you know. Like, for example, the bauxite, a whole lot of bauxite carriers were sunk. And Captain Koulianos was one of the only one that didn't get, lost his ship.
Was there any truth to the fact that there was a blockade of the harbor where they had
A net?
A net? A steel net.
Right,
Prevent
right,
U-boats
right.
from coming in.
To stop U-boats from coming in the
In
harbor.
Yeah.